Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, stories from the 78. And the 78 is well beyond the Chicago limits, even though my guest here, Gail, is in Libertyville. But Gail, your story kind of starts in Ohio all the way to New Orleans in terms of the book that you previously wrote called White Like Her, and your new book, What They Never Told Us. How you doing, Gail?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. The pleasure is all mine. Your book, what an incredible story that touched so many lives. If you wouldn't mind, just go through that a little bit, and then we'll get into why you were compelled to write the second book, which is What They Never Told Us. But I feel like we need to start with the first book just briefly, even though it's been out for some time now. But I thought you just introduced the audience to that story.
Sure. The book White Like Her, the
Mhm.
story began actually 1995. I was between teaching jobs and I had a little extra time and I thought I'd do some research into my maternal grandfather, Azima Frederick from New Orleans. And the reason I
Mhm.
was interested in him was that I had never seen a photograph of him. And every time I asked my mother about him, she would say, well, I don't know when he was born. I don't know when he died. I really know very little about my father because my parents were divorced when I
Mhm.
was 6. So I thought, well, I want to know about him. So in 1995, there's no ancestry.com, right?
No.
So I had to do my research the old fashioned way, which meant I drove to the Family History Center in Buffalo Grove and started there. And I was going through census records because anyone who does genealogy knows that's a great way to start. It
Mhm.
took me a while to find him. And finally, on the 1900 Louisiana census records, I found him, Azima Frederick. He was like 2 or 3. And then I saw
Wow.
something unusual, I thought. Um, he was with a list of Fredericks. They're all in the same household. But there was a B after every single Frederick name. And I traced that up to the column and it said race. So I sat
Mm.
there and I went, wait a second. Does that mean black? So I
Right.
wasn't sure. I'm well aware of the one drop rule in the South and all that. So I went up to the woman who was helping us and I said, I found my family. It said black for race. Does that mean black for sure? And she said, oh, yeah, it does. And then she did the strangest thing. She let loose with all these racial slurs.
What?
Um, yeah,
What do you mean?
directed. Well, she kept saying, don't you remember that candy? I'm not going to say the word, but it begins with an N. N babies.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yes,
I'm
yes.
just
Oh my
standing
gosh.
there going, what is going on? And then, as if I find this amusing, I don't find it amusing. And then
No.
she ends up by saying, oh, you're the one with all the slaves in your family. I was like, okay, I got
What?
to get out of here. I don't know what she's talking about.
This is a
So,
woman working at a history center in
yeah,
Buffalo Grove, Illinois.
that was really weird.
Wow,
So
I'm
it's
sorry.
January, and you know what January in Chicago's like. So
Sure.
I get in my car and I don't leave right away because I'm stunned.
Yeah.
And I look in the rearview mirror and I said, what just happened and who am I? Am I the same white woman who walked into that building or am I don't know what I am.
Hmm.
So, of course, I wanted to talk to my mother. And, as you know, she lived in the Cleveland area.
Hmm.
But this is not a conversation to have on the phone because my mother's a very wily woman. And I knew she'd find a way to get out of telling me this whole story. So, what I do before even contacting her, I write to the state of Louisiana as if I am my mother and pretend that I've lost my birth certificate.
That's a
So,
savvy move.
my girlfriend told me to do this. She used
Yeah,
to write
well,
for the Tribune.
ah,
She
old
said everything
reporter's
had
trick.
to do. So I did. My mom was born in 1921. I get her birth certificate. I open it up, and for race, in parentheses, are 3 letters COL, which I assume means colored.
Hmm.
But I'm a researcher, so I sent another letter to the state of Louisiana and I said, would you please explain to me what COL means? I get a very official letter back with the state seal on it, and it said it means a person of color, more than likely a person of African descent. So I had my answer and I was ready to talk to my mom. However, my dad, right at that time period, became very ill and it was not the right time. It
Hmm.
just wasn't. So he had a protracted illness. I didn't get a chance to talk to my mother until 2 years later in 1997.
Oh my
And I invite
gosh.
her to my house in Illinois, and I say to her, Mom, I have this birth certificate, and it's yours. And on it, it says you're colored. And she got extremely angry and indignant. And she said, I don't know what birth certificate you have, but mine says I'm white. I go, okay. I said, you
Okay.
know what? I've got some other documents. Why don't I go get those? And she says, no. So she sat there for a few minutes and then she looked at me and she said, you can never tell anyone until after I die, because how
Oh
will I
man.
hold my head up with my friends?
Wow. That's
So she
such a
swore me to secrecy and she lived another 17 years. So I kept her secret for that long. I did tell my husband and my two children, and of course my friend from the Tribune, but that
yeah.
was it. That I kept the secret.
I mean, it's such a you. It almost sounds made up story. You know what I mean? I know, and I'm not saying it is at all, but like, my goodness, how do you not? For you waited 2 years because
I
out of
did.
respect of your dad. What was that like for you though, to find something that big and then have to hold on to it for 2 years? I mean, I mean that would. Oh, I mean, was that harder to do that 2 years or wait the 17?
Okay, I think for both, life goes on.
Mm-hmm.
I did get another teaching job. It was a great teaching job at UIC in the
Mm-hmm.
city. So I was working a lot. I still had two children. I had a husband. You just kind of put it in a corner and you let it go. And that's the same thing that happened when I was sworn to secrecy. I mean, by that point though, Ancestry did come out. And
Sure.
so I did do my own research. I found Leon Frederick, who was a private during the Civil War in the Native Guards in Louisiana, which was the first colored troops to serve with the Union. So I found some interesting thing. And when I tried to talk to my mother about that, when I found that out, I called her and I thought maybe finally we'll talk now. Maybe she
Right. She'll
sees
open
I've
up.
kept the secret. I told her about Leon, and this is what she said to me. So how are the kids?
Just denial, huh? Just complete denial.
Yeah,
So
total.
when you mentioned your mother and her reactions to it, and worried about what her friends would think, was it more about who she was? She was afraid that they would find out, or the fact that she wasn't being honest for all those years? What was it more for your mom?
Yeah, I wish I knew. Um, I would guessing I would say it was all of that. I think she was afraid. She had passed for so long. She was married in 1944 in Ohio because in
Hmm.
1944 in the South, a person of color and a white person it was illegal to marry. So, she married my father in Ohio, and I just think she had passed for so long. That was her life, and she didn't want that blown up. She 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 didn't want me to tell my own brother. I only have one sibling. She didn't want me to tell him. So I just think, hey, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to let it sit and go on. I've done a good job of passing, and I think she did have some fear.
Yeah, I think I read a little bit about this story, particularly your mother would wear makeup to bed, and you always thought that was strange. And
Oh
she
yeah,
said it was you never know when the hospital might be an issue where you have to go or whatnot. I mean, and going further in, your mother had to leave that whole entire life behind and
she did.
kind of just bury it into a particular, I think it was a photo album that she kind of still had that she carried with
She
her that
did.
you didn't know about, right? Until she showed
It
it to you.
was. I call it the secret album.
Uh-huh.
She gave it to me after my father died on one of my visits home to Ohio, and she entrusted me with it. I think she knew that I would cherish it and take care of it. And yeah, it showed her life during the war when she left New Orleans and went out to California and was passing out there as well. I mean, there are pictures of her dating, GIs, soldiers, and they're all white,
Hmm.
every single one of them. So when a person passes and they leave their home environment, they recreate themselves. I did a lot of reading on passing for that book because my mom refused to talk to me about it, so I didn't understand the,
Passing. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but for those who
yes,
don't know what
no,
that means.
yeah, I know. And this comes up sometimes when I give a talk. What does that mean? It means my mother had been designated as black. And in
Hmm.
fact, on her 1940 census records, it lists her as Negro.
Hmm.
But she was, I don't know, want to use white enough or could pass for white. Um, and that's what she decided to do. And that for her, I'm sure, opened up opportunities that she wouldn't have had if she had stayed in New Orleans. And, we're talking about a time period where if you were, of African descent, if you were mixed race, and it was visible, you had to sit at the back of the bus. You had to
Hmm.
use a separate water fountain. You couldn't sit in certain places in a restaurant. So, we're talking about that kind of time period. So
Sure.
she didn't want to do that. She made a
Yeah.
decision that wasn't the life she wanted, and she got away with it.
So now you find this information out and you confront your mom and she has since passed. Like, where does that leave you today? Like, were you upset with her when you first found out, or were you sad for her? Like, how did it affect you in your life, with your nuclear family that you have?
Yeah, I was never angry with her. I totally understood. I got where she was coming from, but I was very sad. I was sad that she could not be her authentic self. She had to hide that part of herself. I was sad that she didn't feel like she could trust me enough that once I was keeping the secret, that we could talk about it, mother
Right.
daughter, that we could be more intimate in our relationship. She just was not going to do it. There's nothing I could do to change that. So yeah, it makes me sad.
And I imagine that's what you encountered when you started your second book, because the first book, White Like Her, you published this book, and then out of nowhere, because of the book that your first book there, where people start telling you stories about their encounters and their trial and tribulations with finding out their past. You mentioned somewhere I read where, if you've been in the United States long enough, your family, odds are there's secrets that you don't know. And that's
Yes.
kind of what started happening for you. You want to explain how you came into writing this book called What They Never Told Us?
Okay. Let me back up just a tad.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Once White Like Her came out, I was invited to be on the Today Show, which was a big deal. At
Yeah.
that time, it was the
It's-
Megyn Kelly Today Show.
yeah.
So once those two things happened, White Like Her just blew up. I mean, it just was
Did
like
it
the number.
surprise you how much it
Yes,
was received?
yes, I was totally shocked. I had, and I'm not exaggerating, an avalanche of emails through my website from people, not just in the US, but around the world,
Wow.
Australia, Europe, South Africa. And almost every one of them said, I want to tell you my family secret. And a lot of them said, I have told no one, but I
Wow.
feel like I can tell you. I'm a stranger. I feel like I
Right.
can tell you my family's secret. And many of them had to do with race. Not
Hmm.
all of them. Some of them found out they were adopted, that their dad wasn't their dad, or some, thing like that. So this went on for a while, and I was very, very busy with White Like Her. I was, doing a lot of presentations. I was on, World News, BBC World News. I was
Yeah,
everywhere.
changed your life, right? I mean,
It,
you went,
it totally changed my life.
yeah.
So once things settled down, as most writers do, we think about what are we going to do next
Uh-huh.
in terms of a book. So I didn't immediately write what they never told us. I'm a mystery writer, so I wrote a mystery in between these two nonfiction books.
Okay.
But once I did that, but at the same time, I guess I was finishing up that mystery. I was starting to interview people who had these family secrets. And, thank God for Zoom, right? That's how I was able to do all these interviews. I mean, it took me about 2 years to do the interviews. And
Wow.
yeah, some in the books, I have a section on race and ethnicity. People find out they're a different race or ethnicity. I have a section on adoption. People didn't know they were adopted. And the last section is on donor conception. people didn't know they were donor conceived.
Oh,
And
wow.
in many of these cases, they were never told it was because they did a commercial DNA test. Not in all. Some of them were revealed like there was a very emotional moment in their family life, but most all of them were adults when they found out, meaning that their identities were fixed, just like me.
Hmm.
Until I was 49, I thought I was a white woman.
Hmm.
So in many cases, they're middle-aged and they find out, well, wait a minute, I'm not, I'm biracial, or this is not my father, or these are not my parents. So it's a real identity crisis.
Yeah, I've heard many people who have gone through the, ancestry.com or what have you. And, you hear those stories about, I found out I had his sister and I have, this, that, and the other thing. But then I hear other stories where I found out my dad wasn't my dad,
Yeah.
in terms of biological. So you like hear both sides of it. Like you hear these wonderful stories of families reuniting, and then you hear these other stories that perhaps destroy some families because of lies or of maybe not complete truths of
Yeah.
families. I imagine that had to be really hard to grapple with when you're going down this path with, some of these things where it maybe people tell you a story and you do your research and you're like, oh, that's not all the story. Like there's still a little bit more that you didn't know. Like, did you find yourself in any situation where you're like, ah, like this is tough to be able to I have to tell you all of the truths that I find, not just some of them. Like, did you find a spot where you were just like, this is really tough?
I wasn't a part of their research. I
Mm-hmm.
came in after. So
Got it.
part of this process for people who make these kind of discoveries is part of their healing process was what I learned from them and doing my own research is to search out the biological parent or parents. It's part of knowing your whole history, your whole identity, who
Sure.
you who it's not to say that they're turning their backs on the parents that raised them. That's not it at all. It's just that it's a bigger picture. And
Right.
I always say we want to know our tribe. I mean,
Yeah, for sure.
there's some stories in there. This one woman, she was told that the man who she thought was her stepfather was her real father. This is she was told two different stories about her fathers. But
Oh,
anyhow, she said, I kept looking at everyone because I wanted someone who looked like me. I was the only one with red hair and blue eyes in the whole family. I was so desperate that I looked at my grandmother's thumb and I thought, okay, we have the same thumb. Well, this was not her blood grandmother. This was not her biological father. So she had been lied to twice.
oh my gosh.
She does eventually find him. Um, and she knocks on his door. This is an incredible story.
Oh,
They tell you not to do this, actually. They tell you to send a letter. And
right. Give them a little breathing room, right?
I think she tried, and I think he did not answer. So one Sunday, her and her husband drove to his house. She figured out where he lived and everything. She hired a geneticist to help her.
Hmm.
She knocked on the door. She told him who she was, and he just acted like he didn't, I don't know what you're talking about. So he closed the door. She drove up the block, and she sat in the car. And she's a therapist, by the way. She looked at her husband. And she said, he knows me. I could tell by the look in his eyes.
Of
He knows
course.
me. She went back, knocked again. He
Like she turned the
welcomed her.
car around back. Like she was
Yes,
still in the. Oh my
she was up the
gosh.
block. She said, I got to try again. I
Okay.
could see it in his eyes. He knows me. He sees my mother in me. She went back. This time he let her in. And they had several years together.
Oh
She thought
wow.
she was an only child. She had a half brother. And they're very close. I
Wow.
mean, if she hadn't been that persistent, she wouldn't have had that, that wonderful thing happen for her to really have and get to know her biological father. She now knows that her roots are from Scotland via Canada and all these things she never knew.
And this is just one of the stories that
Just
you've
one.
Yeah, I mean, you probably got hundreds, if not thousands, of people wanting you to tell their story, and you have to figure out a way which ones go in this book. I imagine that's a little bit of a daunting
Yeah,
task.
I had help with that. There's a woman whose story is actually in the book. Her name's Cara. She, after she made her discovery, she found her, she was so, I don't want to say traumatized because she did heal, but it was so emotional for her
Hmm.
that she founded, it's a well-known organization among the communities of people who make these discoveries. It's called Right to Know, meaning right to know your genetic identity.
Hmm.
And she founded this organization for people who make these discoveries. And her story is pretty amazing as well. Yeah, in DNA, she was raised as a biracial woman. Her dad was black, her mother was white.
Hmm.
At least that's what she was told. When she would go to school, she'd be ridiculed, called nasty names, racist names. One day in school, a girl said to her, "Are you biracial?" And Cara said, "I am." And the girl slapped her in the face.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so she fought for this identity. She said, her black grandfather said to her, "You know, Cara, if things get bad in this country and you have to pass, I want you to pass because I think you could pass." And she said, "No, I would never do that. I would never turn my back on my race."
Wow.
So she takes the DNA test. She gives a gift to her black father and one to her for Christmas because they want to go back to Africa and trace their roots.
Hmm. Hmm.
She opens her test. Half of her is white. The other half is Ashkenazi Jew. She is not biracial.
Wow. That's
Yes.
incredible. How,
Oh, it's
wow.
even more incredible. Um, so she hires a geneticist to find her
Uh-huh.
biological father. Well, he's deceased, but she finds the family. He was known as the Salmon King of Seattle, extremely wealthy businessman.
I'm sorry, did you say the Salmon King of Seattle?
Yes,
Oh,
Sam
that's
Rubenstein.
wow. So like what did that do for her? Was she like upset, happy, sad because she just didn't know,
She was
missed
really
out on knowing,
confused. She was really confused.
confused? Yeah, I
Yeah,
bet you that's a big one.
she had a heck of a time reconstructing her identity. And what made it worse, when she went, to the family, the Rubenstein family, they rejected her, almost all of them, because they thought she was after their money.
Really?
Yeah, and she said, "I wasn't after their money. I was after medical history." So they came to an agreement. She would not seek any kind of, inheritance at all, but she would own her own story and be able to tell it. And she has
Wow.
really embraced her Jewish side as well. I mean, that's part of her healing.
So in writing this book, getting all these stories and hearing these wonderful stories and how people react to them, what did it do for you that the first book didn't do?
Oh,
Just
well,
curious.
the difference for me, writing the first book, I felt pretty comfortable because it was my mother's story and my
Mm.
story. And I did a lot of research, like I always do. I learned about passing. I learned about free people of color. I traced the family back to, 1700s colonial Louisiana, an enslaved woman by the name of Marta. But when I wrote this book, it was different because I had to well, I did do this. I'm a very empathetic person.
Hmm.
So I put myself in their shoes. So when I would be transcribing, I transcribed everything, every single thing they said. It didn't matter if it was meaningful or not. I felt like I'm not going to understand that if I didn't do that.
Sure.
And when I say transcribe, I don't mean just write down what they're saying. It's like you and me having this conversation. I can
Hmm.
read a lot from your face, your gestures, just like you can the same with me. So I would
Sure.
note things like that. So I would get so into their stories. I started having really strong emotional reactions. There's one story in there, Brad Ewell, that I literally got so emotional over his story, I had to stop and take oh, I think I took 5 days off before I returned
Wow.
to it because it was also, I'm a human being. I had things going on in my life. My brother was
Shh.
very ill. So he was talking about lost time, and I was just tearing up and thinking of my brother and all the lost time. And because my brother died, it'll be 2 years in December, and
Oh,
he's
I'm
my
sorry.
younger brother. So it was really extremely emotional for me. So yeah, that's when you get into other people's stories. If you allow yourself, you really get into other people's stories. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I imagine just, that's why I think stories are so powerful and why people seek them at particular times of year. Christmas, there's Christmas movies and holiday movies and whatnot. But, I 100% understand why people gravitated to you to help tell their story because you did such an amazing job with your story and you were vulnerable and you put it out there. I'm like, I mean, I didn't happen to ask you this, but like, what would your mom think of it being out there and you telling the story? Would she be mad at you, or would she finally be like, "No, it's time. It's okay."
You know what? I've actually thought about that. I think she'd be okay. I think she'd be okay because of the way I told her story, the honesty behind it, and the empathy I showed not only to her, but to my father. And we haven't mentioned this, but part of my story with my mother's family is that after I was on Genealogy Roadshow, 3 days later, um, the family I didn't know existed contacted me. My grandfather had a second family. I
Oh,
was a little bit aware that he had remarried. I didn't know he had 5 other children.
wow.
So, yeah, one of my cousins, Stephanie Frederick, sent me an email and said, I saw you on the road show. I want to tell you I'm your cousin, and my father, Azima Frederick, is your uncle, and we want to welcome you to our family. I sat there, it was in the morning, and I just cried because at this point in my life, both my parents are gone. Every
Mhm.
aunt and uncle I've ever known, dead. And now I had an uncle and a cousin. Well, it turns out I ended up having two aunts as well, and a whole slew of cousins.
Yeah, you have another
And
family party to get to.
they threw a party for me in New Orleans that April. We all got together and met each other. It was awesome. It was
Yeah,
just awesome.
that's just it's like almost takes my breath away even thinking about that because I imagine it was real. You maybe felt a little relief, like you were saying, I imagine you felt slightly alone with everybody that you knew as far as you knew passed, right? And then you find out you have this whole other family and sense of relief that you're not by yourself and that you have this whole other family. But I imagine also a little bit of like, man, I wish my mom knew, or I wish she knew all of it. I wish she would have known the whole story, like how much it could have been different for her and for my brother and me. You know what I mean? Like I
I
imagine
agree.
all of that went through
I
your mind.
totally agree with you. And when I went to that reunion, it was in April, and my mother had only been gone about a year, and I was in heavy grief. And I sat, we sat at a table to eat, and across from me was my Uncle Fred. We call him Uncle Fred, Azima
Hmm.
Frederick, and my two aunts, Alma and Brenda. And I kept staring at them, and I had to apologize. It was
I
like
get
looking,
that.
it was like looking at my mother. It was like seeing her alive again. And it was so moving to me.
How did your family react? This new family that is your old family turns out, but new to you, how did they react to you being with them? Did they have the same kind of like, oh my gosh, you look just like your mother, or you look like your father? Like, how did they react to you being a
Well,
part of their lives?
they didn't know my mother at all. My mother, this is my grandfather's second family, so I don't
Right.
think there was much interaction, though I did find out through one of my cousins that my mother's sister did know them, but my mother was already gone. She was living in Ohio, so she had no interaction
But did they
with
know
them.
of her, like in
I
like
don't
the
think
ants?
so.
Oh
And
wow, okay.
my mom had a sort of no, not sort of. She had a chaotic childhood, meaning that neither of her parents raised her. She was kind of shuffled around, grandmother, cousin. So there wasn't a lot of family unity for her.
Hmm.
So I think that's part of the split. This happens.
And but then your mother goes on to live a life like she figured it out, by having that sporadic childhood that you're talking about and getting shuffled around and not having what people would call maybe like a nuclear family where mom and dad are there and so and so, the upbringing in Ohio and Midwest, your mom figured out how to do all of that. That's incredible. Just that little story. There's like so many stories within the stories that you're telling here. It's a lot. I can't imagine what it's like for you, but my goodness, like what do you take away from all of this experience with hearing about your mother's childhood and how she did it and left family to finding out about this family that you didn't know and your mother didn't know? Like, what do you feel now? Like, how does this resonate with you today?
Well, in terms of my mother, I look at her differently now that I know everything. She's an incredible survivor. She was incredibly smart about passing. There's a whole section in White Like Her where I talk about my mother loved going to the movies. And back then, you'd see two movies on a Friday. So I was her
Double feature.
companion, double feature.
Hmm.
And she learned how, I say this, I think she learned how to be white by watching these movies.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Like the golden
she
age of
was,
Hollywood, right? Where she got to see
yes,
all that play
she
out on
was very
screen.
glamorous. My mother was very glamorous. So she did that. So what this has done for me, it is, of course, opened me up to a whole world that I didn't know in terms of my family, my personal family. It has opened me up to, one of the reasons I wrote White Like Her is because I didn't want to feel the shame my mother felt about her identity. I wanted to be proud of the Fredericks, and that's why I traced this family all the way back to Marta, the enslaved woman, and just went not decade, but person by person to show what were the racial designations in this country, what they had to endure to survive, and how they survived. So I'm really proud of that. That gives me great pride, and it gives me great empathy, as you were saying earlier, to the people that I interviewed. And many of them said to me, I feel I can trust you with this
Which
because
is a
you've
huge
already
honor.
gone through this. So we cut to the chase. We didn't have to go
Yeah.
through a lot.
You didn't have to audition. They already wanted you, in other
Yeah,
words.
exactly. I think that's why they felt comfortable telling me a lot of things they might not have told another person.
So I imagine all the stories didn't make it in the book. Is there another book on the way where you're going to delve into a little bit more? Or are you going to pivot and go to somewhere completely different or go back to mystery writing?
Right now, I'm not sure. It's been extremely draining.
Yeah, I
Um,
can imagine.
I If I were to write another book, the next one probably would be a mystery, maybe. I don't know. I need a rest. I need to
So
take a rest.
was this your eighth book or ninth book?
Okay, so I have 5 mysteries and 2 nonfiction.
Oh, so
So
I was off by one.
seven.
I'm sorry.
I do have a book of poems that's on Amazon. I spent a year actually going around Chicago area shelters interviewing homeless mothers with children. And I put that in a book of poetic monologues, but I published that myself. All my other books were published by a publisher. So I guess if you want to count that one, that would be
Well,
eight.
sure. You wrote it, right?
Yeah, I did. I did.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess you have a lot to decide how you want to continue your story. That will be the next book. But in the meantime, it is the holiday season. So I'm sure that you just want to pump the brakes a little bit and enjoy yourself, decompress, recharge the emotional battery, right?
Yes, very much so. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, if folks want to, find more information about you and your books, I imagine they can go to your website, right?
Yes,
And
www.gaillukasik.com.
well, Gail, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking time to chat with me and give me almost 40 minutes of your time here during the week. That's incredible and very generous. So thank you very much. And are you doing any book signings coming up for the holiday season? Are you completely shutting off from doing anything work related and just enjoying your time?
I do have a presentation I'm doing in January at the Ethical Humanist Society in Skokie, where I think it's open to everybody. I will be signing books there, and I haven't set this up yet, but the Barnes and Noble in Skokie want me to do a signing as well. We just haven't settled on a date, so those are in the nearer future, and I'm sure
Okay.
there'll be more, along the line.
and just head over to your website because I'm sure that will be updated with all that information. Those two
Yes.
events are strangely close to my house. I live right by, if you
Oh,
know where Superdog is, on Devon and Milwaukee, just in the Chicago city limits, right by Skokie.
oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yep, that's where I am. So I'll come visit you. It'd be lovely to talk to you in person.
It would be. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you and have a great holiday season.